Good morning. So delighted to have you with us and for this webinar that Seventh Generation Interfaith is hosting on fiduciary duty, faith-based fiduciary duty. We are going to begin in listen-only mode for all of our participants until the Q&A section. We'll also be, as you know, recording this and posting the slides and the video on our website. This particular topic and this particular webinar builds on a series of things that we've been trying to work on in conjunction with our members. We've shared, for instance, resources that have come to us from US CIF. We've also hosted a previous webinar on a holistic approach to social responsible investing. In that one, we had with us Susan Smith-Makos of Mercy Investment Services and Anita Green, who is then with Westpath. And this particular webinar will build on that in some very particular ways and can be something very useful, of course, for people from sort of both sides of the house and many of our members, those who are in kind of the justice and peace or integrative creation side of things, as well as those who are treasurers, CFOs in our members. I would especially recommend those of you who are in the justice and peace area to think about, if they're not actually on this webinar, sharing the webinar with your treasurer or with your CFO, and as part of an ongoing process of deepening the commitments around social responsible investing inside of our membership. With us today, then, in this webinar, we have Frank Coleman. Frank is the vice chair at Christian Brothers Investment Services, where he served for more than 30 years. Frank has developed a comprehensive knowledge of the needs of Catholic institutions and Catholic institutional marketplace, and is a nationally recognized expert in the application of Catholic social teaching to the investment process. Prior to being named vice chair at CBIS, he was executive vice president, responsible for corporate strategy and planning, strategic planning, and board member and trustee relations and development, as well as overseeing Catholic responsible investing and technology departments. Frank joined CBIS initially back in 1987, if I'm correct. He's also served as chair of the board of partners for the Common Good, which is an impact investing, community investing program sponsored by CBIS. And in ICCR, he's served on the board, a period of time as vice chair, a period of time as chair. And just at the end of October, in fact, Frank received ICCR's Legacy Award at an event in the midst of the ICCR Fall Conference. He's written and spoken extensively on matters related to ESG and CRI investing, and he joins us from the SRI conference in Colorado Springs, a place where he has more advantageous or more favorable weather than those of us who are in Wisconsin right now. And it's really our privilege that this is his last public event with CBIS after a long and distinguished career there. And so we're really delighted that he's taken the time to be with us today. With that, Frank, I'll pass it to you and let you lead us through the slides that you've prepared for us.
Well, thank you, Chris, and I really appreciate the opportunity. It is my last, and Chris's reference is I am retiring at the end of this year from CBIS, and so it will be my last official CBIS presentation, hopefully not my last presentation of any kind. The first thing I want to do is just do a sound check to make sure that I'm audible and clear and everyone's hearing. Okay, and I'm getting the thumbs up from Chris that that's the case. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate being here. The conversation today is around the concept of the faith-based fiduciary and how can we get our heads around that and think about it in ways that are specific to our institutions and organizations, especially from the perspective of the responsibilities that a fiduciary has to act in the best interests of its particular client. And in this case, we're talking about faith-based clients. And there's some misunderstanding, misinformation, misinterpretations that are out there in the marketplace that we've hit up upon a number of times as we've spoken to a number of our organizations that we work with. And so hopefully this presentation will add some clarity to that. I do have a number of disclosures. When you work in a corporate environment, you You're required to say some things. Obviously, this presentation is not about any of the funds or investment products offered by CBIS, and it does not constitute an offer to buy and sell any securities. Second disclosure is that I am speaking as a private citizen, and my comments do not necessarily reflect the views of CBIS and its related entities. I think that's all I need to say in that regard. For those of you that aren't familiar, what we have next is just a general overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to spend some time talking about the CRI, SRI lexicon. And CRI, just to be clear, is a term that CBIS uses. It's our version of socially responsible investing, and we call it Catholic responsible investing. And I'm going to use terms interchangeably, even though having come to this, this conference, there's still a lot of angst in the marketplace about the various terms that are out there, and some concern about the confusion that creates in the marketplace. But we'll talk about that in a second. And so it's about what is a fiduciary, talking some things about that. There's some myths that are out there about what fiduciary duty requires. And then talk about what I think is the role of the term I use here is Catholic fiduciary. But having worked in this field for a number of times and worked alongside a number of faith-based organizations, it's clear to me that the rules are generally the same. The precepts and the teachings that you might reference in support of that will be slightly different. But from a denominational standpoint, there is really no difference between a Catholic fiduciary and a faith-based fiduciary. So if I inadvertently slip, it's because I've given this presentation so many times using the term Catholic, but as I say, it applies to the faith-based fiduciaries as well. I did have another disclosure that I am not an attorney. That will either be a good thing or a bad thing from some people's perspectives. My role here is not to provide legal advice or legal framework for that. But as someone who spent a long amount of time in the field and has come across these terms and the legal definitions, et cetera, I'm hoping to provide a 30,000-foot level, a broad view of what this is all mean. But it really is contingent upon any one of you working within your organizations to speak with appropriate legal counsel to get their perspective on some of these concepts and thoughts. And you might be able to educate some of them, because some of the materials that I'm going to present to you, they may not have access to, or have had a chance to read, or have become aware of. So let's get started, Chris. A quick summary of what CBIS does for those of you who aren't familiar with it. I'll leave it for you to look at that at your leisure in case you have any questions about that, but I'm not going to spend any time on that particular slide. As we talk about Catholic fiduciary, or the role of fiduciary, there's some, as it relates to ESG, there are some common misperceptions, and I just wanted to name them here. Folks on the call might have others that they've experienced in interactions with their various entities, but as we've taken this path over the last 30 some odd years that I've been there, these are the three primary ones that we at CBIS have encountered, primarily on investment committees, as we're talking about fiduciary duty and enacting CRI criteria into the portfolio. The first is a sense that somehow the legal framework under which fiduciary duty resides limits that the law doesn't permit integration of ESG. That's a pretty common understanding or statement that are made, typically sometimes by lawyers sitting on a committee, other times by members who might come from the financial services field that have been involved in fiduciary responsibilities before. But that's the first myth, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that and providing a slightly different framework. The second is responsible investing limits returns, that by virtue of trying to incorporate a set of criteria that are different from financial requirements, that somehow you automatically are going to limit returns. Simply stated, I've heard this expressed in investment committees, such as, as a not-for-profit and as a member of this committee, my responsibility is to get to the highest return, and then you can use that return in your nonprofit mission ways, et cetera, et cetera. I hear that all the time. And then there's a presumption that in doing that, implied in that statement, and sometimes stated explicitly, is that my getting the maximum return means that I can't take account of these non-financial criteria because they're just going to drag the return down. And so if I'm not getting you the best return, then I'm abridging my responsibility to you as an advisor. So second myth, and we'll come back to these shortly. And then the third is that responsible investing is difficult to implement. And I'm going to say that there's some truth to that, but not in the way that the difficulty is not a barrier for implementing it. It just provides a roadmap for creative ways of thinking about implementing. And there's not a all one way or no way method of implementing CRI or responsible investing across a variety of portfolios. So it's not something that you can snap your fingers at and say, I'm just going to do it. That's true, but it's not as complicated or as difficult as it's sometimes it's said to be. So those are the three myths, and I think we're going to just spend some time talking about them individually. This is one of my favorite slides. I was doing a presentation yesterday at the conference, and I referenced this slide. So you're going to see a series of terms. Since I've been involved in this field starting in 1987, each one of these have been terms that have defined the activity of socially responsible investing, and they're still in use today. Obviously the large red highlighted faith-based investing, I assume all of the people on the call fall into that category. But you have green investing, triple bottom line, values-based, ethical, impact, ESG, sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. All of these are terms that, and we use the term Catholic responsible investing. These are all terms that are a part of the environment, and some would say they create some confusion. Chris, if you could go, yes, thank you. The duck, where does the duck come from? Well, I learned a long time ago that if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and even rides a scooter like a duck, it's a duck. And all of that is not to diminish that language is important and the words that we use are important. But it's to say that, in essence, all of these terms operate in the same quadrant. That is, SRI is the practice of investing with the consideration of environmental, social, and/or governance issues across one or more asset classes. Each of the industry players, US CIF or PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investing, which is an international collaboration coalition, US CIF, which is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing, and they represent industry, financial professionals that are involved in this field, have that as the definition broadly of SRI ESG. So where do all these other terms come from? Well, they're really specialty terms. That is, they are meant to reflect the uniqueness of pools of investors who coalesce around this concept in slightly different ways. So that, for instance, if you are a foundation, you're typically going to be talking about mission-based investing. If you're someone who is concerned about the environment and that's your sole focus, you might be a green investor. Impact investing looks at and tries to draw metrics that are not only financial, but also social. What is my consideration when I inject these environmental, social, and government considerations into the portfolio? What's the impact to society? How do I talk about that? So that's what impact investing is. And what I would say, and there's still tension within the industry about this, is they occupy the same quadrant. I'm not going to go so far as to say they can be used interchangeably, but during the course of this, I will use some of these interchangeably because I do think that they apply to the group that's on the call. I do sometimes, depending on the audience that I'm speaking with, will use different terms than Catholic. Well, for Catholic groups, I use Catholic responsible investing. But if I'm in front of a group of folks that are involved with family offices, then I'll use impact or ESG investing, because I understand that that term coalesces their sense of who they are and how they invest, as opposed to another term. So I don't know if you've experienced this, but this is a raging conversation in the industry about the lack of clarity among definitions. And quite frankly, I think it's much ado about nothing. This is my personal opinion. Because when we talk about, I don't know how many of you sit through manager meetings and all those sorts of things, but let's take, for instance, the definition of what is it a value investor? And what is a value manager? Well, a value manager is trying to buy securities that are underpriced according to some sort of fundamental analysis. That's the basic definition of what a values investor does. I could sit 15 value asset managers in front of you, and how they would describe themselves would sound very different than that definition. So, there's a general definition that kind of defines the work that we do, but we then, we sub-aggregate that according to our specialties and practices and all those sorts of stuff. And that's what these definitions really are about, is the specialized application for particular segments of the overall financial services industry that are involved in this sort of activity. Next slide, please. So, general overview, what's SRI? It considers these ESG factors to generate financial returns and positive societal impact. That if you are characterizing yourself as an impact, ESG, et cetera investor, that primal definition is one that you should be abiding from, and that your investors should be able to see in your work. And some of it is about ESG incorporation, and then some of it is about active ownership or corporate engagement. And some will do some will do some of a little. It varies. Again, there's not a universal standard against which we are measured. And quite frankly, I'm not quite sure at this point in the evolution there needs to be. These definitions emanate from the US CIF, which is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing. As I said before, that's the industry group here in the US that represents ESG financial professionals. Next slide. So let's talk about the key parties. I'm going to suggest that while the names might be slightly different for your organization, these are the key parties that are involved in the investment process or your investment management program or process. You may not have all of them, you might have one or two more, but basically I think these represent the major constellations of responsibilities that are assigned to the particular portfolio. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to name it because sometimes with all the work that's going on, we forget what are the basic building blocks that go into the types of decision makings that lead us to question fiduciary duty and integration of ESG. So you typically have investment committees, you have investment managers, sometimes there might be an investment consultant, financial advisor, broker, and service providers. Any one of these constellations of or parties might have a fiduciary responsibility, and not all of them necessarily have to. So you cannot pick you can't say, for instance, an investment consultant is a fiduciary for our organization just because they're an investment consultant. It really has to go with what you've negotiated with them in terms of what they deliver to you. So all of these are the pieces. Some parts of these or all of them might be fiduciaries, or you have situations where all of them might. And in a lot of situations, your service providers, which would be the back office operations of groups, they may not have fiduciary responsibility and oversight. But there are some key cases, especially if you've outsourced some responsibilities, where those service providers do have fiduciary oversight of the asset. So just be aware of these component parts, and some of them or all of them, or in some cases, none of them might have a fiduciary relationship with the organization. Next. So what's a fiduciary? And I apologize if all of this is is starting at too basic a level, but I think it's important to understand. And I'm going to suggest that the concept of fiduciary is a legal concept in common law, and it is really, there may be slight differences depending on where you're engaging in your fiduciary responsibilities, but these are basic duties that are across the board responsibilities that any fiduciary has. So, for instance, if I'm acting as a fiduciary to my aging parents and their finances, and my responsibility is to manage their finances and help them on a day-to-day basis, I'm acting as a fiduciary on their behalf. If I'm sitting on an investment committee and managing assets for an institution, I'm acting as a fiduciary for that. So regardless of the nature or the task that you're involved in, these are the basic duties, and they seem to be the basic duties across any of those tasks. They're common to anyone who's in that responsibility. And essentially, all fiduciary means is that you've been given legal and statutory responsibility to act on behalf of another. And again, that could be managing their finances, that could be in healthcare, it could be in a wide range of activities. But that's the basic definition of what a fiduciary does. And there's some basic duties of a fiduciary. The responsibilities of loyalty and reasonable care, that your first responsibility when you're acting in the role of fiduciary to that particular organization, your loyalty is to that organization, not to yourself, not to the company that you represent, not to anyone but that organization. And as that, so I sit on a number of boards, and one of them is a Catholic University board. When I'm in that board meeting, my responsibility is to be loyal to that college, that university. I'm on the board of our pooled funds, the Kiewit funds. When I'm sitting on that board, my responsibilities are to the investors in those funds. So that's the duty of loyalty is not one that transfers from place to place. It's one that's specific to my loyalty is to the organization in which is sitting right in front of me as I'm engaging in my fiduciary responsibilities. Duty of reasonable care is that you will be thoughtful, be objective, do the homework that's necessary to understand how the organization works, that you're taking reasonable care to make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization based on your understanding of the organization and the environment in which it works. So there is a responsibility to take it seriously, if you will, in a lot of respects. The others abide by the exclusive benefit rule, that it's the organization that receives the benefit of your advice, void conflicts of interest, and abide by the governing document. And there are different types of fiduciary responsibility that are dictated by law. These are the three most common ones that are part of the financial services industry. There's an ERISA Act that governs pension funds and pension assets, Investment Advisors Act of 1940. So as an investment advisor, I have certain responsibilities that are outlined in that act, and they expand my responsibilities as fiduciary and they add color to those responsibilities when I'm giving advice to an organization, investment advice. And then there's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, all of these, and that's essentially for foundations and similar types of organizations. So there are statutory requirements for anyone that's acting as a fiduciary to certain types of assets that expand on some of these duties of basic duties of fiduciary. So ERISA, this is about pension assets. This is about, so as we look at this is the expansion of those basic fiduciary responsibilities. I don't know that I'm going to spend a ton of time on all of these, but you can see that in addition to those basic responsibilities, they start to begin to define that the plan is run solely in the interest of participants and beneficiaries, that as a trustee of the plan, you're not going to receive any outsized benefit individually from that. It's solely for providing benefits and paying reasonable plan expenses. So you have a responsibility to know how much the benefits and structure are going to cost the beneficiaries, and to then make decisions about reasonable cost given what the beneficiaries are receiving. And they act prudently, and there's a prudent expert standard that's, again, ingrained in law that talks about reasonableness and the types of things that, you know, if you look at a variety of different things with a plan, returns, risks, lots of other different things, then you can be deemed to be acting prudently. So similar to, again, some of the basics, it's just each one of these begin to define specific areas that they want fiduciaries to be much more aware of in terms of the enactment of their responsibilities. We go to the next one, please. So this is the Investment Advisors Act. Again, same thing. This is one case where acting as an investment advisor, by law, if I'm acting as an investment advisor, there's no situation in which I cannot be a fiduciary. So if I'm managing your assets or giving you advice on those assets, then I'm acting as a fiduciary in your best interest. And depending on the nature of that relationship, these are the responsibilities that I have in that regard. This typically would apply to some consultants that have some level of oversight of assets on behalf of clients, investment advisors. There is a component of this that now applies to brokers and RIAs, registered investment advisors, which operate more on the retail side. But clearly, asset managers, anyone that is that you've hired to manage your assets, fall under this broad scope of particular responsibilities. We can move on to the next. Same as it relates to the foundations, endowments, and similar type government type not-for-profits. Again, it's just the laws that apply specifically to these are meant to kind of add some granularity to that sense of fiduciary. Excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, I didn't want to cough in everyone's ear. So here, fiduciary duty continuum. These are the key parties. And this is the basic structure of where fiduciary responsibility resides and who generally acts as fiduciaries in full, limited, or generally no capacity. Now, as I've said before, this is a 30,000-foot level. And so within these definitions, there can be some variations. For instance, there are situations where service providers can be fiduciaries if they exercise some level of control or discretion in how assets are moved, managed, or whatever. Typically, that's not the role that service providers provide, but there are limited situations where that can be the case. So the congregation fiscal officer on the front end, typically owners of assets, and those that advise those owners have some level of fiduciary responsibility. And it really depends on the amount of discretion that's given. Now, discretion is defined as the ability to make those decisions on their own without having to receive approval at the front end, that is from the owner of the assets. So for instance, prior to my mom's passing, when my brother and I were managing her resources, we would have been considered to, and we were exercising full discretion. That is, we were invested as trustees. We were not required to go back to her and say, this is what we want to do. Do we have your permission? We were not required to go back and get her to sign various documents. We were authorized signatories on the account. So we had full discretion. And that moved us from a limited fiduciary role into a full fiduciary role as it relates to that. And so, again, it really, your investment committee typically has limited fiduciary responsibilities because they're giving advice that needs to be approved by a larger body. And typically it's the owner of the assets. I just remembered that I usually stop for questions here, but we don't have the capacity. So if you have a question, just write it down. And when we come to the question and answer period, we'll do it. But this is an area where most people get tripped up because they make assumptions or presumptions. And it really, typically when you have fiduciaries involved, there's an agreement between you and the fiduciary or some sort of governing document that talks about who has responsibility for what. That's really where you find where this plays out in terms of your organization. And that's where you'll find who's a full fiduciary, who has limited fiduciary responsibility, and who has no fiduciary responsibility. All right, let's move on. So now we're going to talk about some of those myths of fiduciary duty and how we begin to break them down. So first myth, fiduciary duty limits integration of ESG into the management of a portfolio. There's a study dating back to 2005. So it's interesting that this still comes up because I think there's what I'm going to give to you is, which presented here, is our resources that can be used to help clarify in people's minds just what limits there might be, or in other matters that we'll talk about, just whether or not there's performance issues that are related to this. There's a fairly substantial body of information that's out there that debunks some of these myths. And so what you'll see in the ensuing slides are those specific references that you can go to, read, point to, disperse to your fiduciaries to say, well, tell me how that relates given this information, and have the conversation with them. So what the Frishfield studies essentially said is that there are situations in which these ESG factors do have a material impact on a company and can have an impact on the company's performance. So as a result, some of these non-financial criteria, because they can impact the financial performance of a company, are and should be within the realm of fiduciaries' responsibilities to enact and incorporate. So let's go to the next slide. I think there's one other, yes. So, and there was a follow-up report to that was done by PRI, again, the Fiduciary Duty in the 21st Century. And that looked across this concept globally to say that this sense of fiduciary duty precluding ESG factors was really starting to break down. And the way that it was breaking down is when it can be demonstrated that, for instance, the environment, a company with a poor environmental performance, if it can be demonstrated that that poor environmental performance leads to poor financial performance, then it's the responsibility of the fiduciary to take that into consideration. And a company that is involved even in sourcing overseas. Let's take an example of Apple. It had a huge scandal that took away about $1 billion of its market cap in a day when it was found that there were significant health issues in some of its factories over in China, one in particular. So that's a direct causal, relationship between impact and the social issues. And what the studies say is that if you can determine that there is that sort of impact, and the failure to consider these long-time investment drivers, then it's within the purview, and not only within the purview, it's the responsibility of the fiduciary to consider, to look at this, and to make sure that it's taking into consideration how that impacts the ability to deliver superior performance. So a very different concept than the one that says, nope, all we need to look at is, you know, the financial numbers that come out of the company to make a determination, or the performance. No, it goes beyond the field would say it goes beyond that. Let's move on. Again, just additional resources. The 2015 sorry, Department of Labor bulletin that that was replacing a 2008 bulletin that essentially says, and you can read it there, in those circumstances where these environmental, social, and governance issues may have a direct relationship to the economic value of the plan's investment, it's part of fiduciary's responsibility to look at these in the context of economic merits of making these competing investment choices. We can move on. Again, more just additional areas, investment policy statements and investment analysis. Again, you know, if I am an investor and I have an investment policy statement and I indicate that, you know, I want to have some of these factors incorporated, or I want these issues to be reviewed, or I have a concern about X, Y, or Z issue, your fiduciary is required to act on your behalf and to consider those issues as they look at developing the portfolio, managing the portfolio, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all, again, just the byproducts of that trend that says fiduciary, the responsibility of fiduciaries has and is changing as it relates to incorporation of ESG factors into decisions around portfolio, whether it's managing the portfolio, whether it's providing advice to the portfolio, et cetera. Let's go. All of these are the September in 2015, the IRS issued a new rule that, that gave mission-related investments the expanse to say that it doesn't necessarily, again, decisions about ESG do not necessarily put fiduciaries in violation of their fiduciary responsibilities. That's the essence of what that new rule has done. And so for foundations, it was really a watershed moment, because it allowed them to, it required that their fiduciaries begin thinking about these ways in ways that they had before just been able to dismiss because of the potential impact of violating an IRS rule. So some more, this is the advisor's fiduciary practice. Again, just another resource to look at, another statement of the changing role of from an advisor standpoint, from an RIA. Criteria 272 is intriguing. If a client has elected a socially responsible investment strategy, the client's investment policy statement documents, including implementation and monitoring procedures, need to be part of the fiduciary's responsibility. So all of this is to say, I think there might be one more slide. I might have overdone it in terms of, okay. All of this is really about putting information in front of you that says that you no longer have to fight the fight, that fiduciaries are not permitted legally to consider ESG factors when they're making decisions for your portfolio, whether it's the selection of asset managers, whether it's a focus on issues or companies. Their responsibility, if you are an investor for whom this is important, and you're legally able to do that, then it's the responsibility of fiduciary to consider that as part of their acting on your behalf. Let's, again, I would normally stop here, but let's go on. So fiduciary duty requires maximization of return, and it's not permitted to choose between returns and feeling good. That was the statement that I referenced before, and the way that it's usually phrased, or maybe the way that I've heard it phrased a number of times. So again, data for you. Larry Fink is the chairman of BlackRock, which is the largest asset management firm in the US, and I think probably the third largest in the world, who publicly stated that sustainable investing is a core component for how everyone invests in the future. We're going to see evidence in the long term that sustainable investing will be at least equivalent to core investments. And he stated that it will be higher. If you keep scrolling through so these are other, thank you. These are studies that have been done that talk about this. The 2015 Deutsche Asset Management study in Hamburg University really looked at aggregated evidence from more than, I think it was actually 2,100 empirical studies. And it's called a meta-analysis or meta-analysis to see whether or not, and it looked at all the studies that started in 1970 that looked at impact of ESG criteria on performance. And what the study essentially showed is that, in fact, rather than ESG factors taking away from performance, they were either neutral or positive to performance. That there was no empirical data that demonstrated that a priori, just by doing ESG, meant you were getting less returns. Now, how you do it is the question. It's not a question that if you do it, it's going to take away returns. No, it's how you do it. And that seemed reasonable, that if you were able to demonstrate that there was a direct link, causal link between a particular issue and potential for negative performance, then that was a reasonable way of thinking about it, as opposed to, I don't like this and therefore let's not do it. And what's happened in the industry is that, as this industry has grown, much more attention is being paid to asset manager side of making the correlations between environmental, social, and governance issues and particular performance, so that the metrics are being created, and in the environment, they're already there. The environment leads itself to measurement very easily, because you can measure the amount of effluents that is being put into a river or being put into the air, or what dumping does to a particular area. You can measure those things, whereas human rights is a little bit less. You can't really measure what a company's human rights activity does, except now I should say you couldn't measure many years ago, but now there are ways that are doing it. You can measure it. One of the biggest measures is impact, what they call PR risk or brand risk. The example of Apple is a perfect example of that. They lost $1 billion of capital in a day when the news came out about the fire at their sourcing factory. Now, they didn't own the factory; they subcontracted it out, which is even more interesting. But their brand suffered because they were the major user of that particular factory. I think there's one more slide I probably included. Yeah. So these are more empirical analysis, and these are all what I call field-tested academic research studies. So they are defensible. They have been tested, and in the industry of academic studies, they would be perceived as being quality, and not, it's not someone in the back seat of a car churning numbers. There's a term for it that I forget at the moment that they have when a study meets all the academic requirements. It's stupid. These are all, again, pieces of information that says doesn't necessarily return. Now, CBIS, we started measuring this, whether or not there was an impact on performance, just in our own particular funds. Forget about the marketplace. And we started that in about 1990. And what we found is that depending on issue, there is a cyclical nature to performance and underperformance by integrating ESG factors. But over a market cycle, the impact was either negative or positive. The impact was either nominal or positive. That over a cycle, we didn't find that, for instance, not investing in X resulted in negative returns for a full market cycle. Now, it might have in any given market cycle when that particular industry might have been in favor and we didn't own it, but over a full market cycle, at least. So our own internal study mimics or supports these broader studies in the marketplace. I keep, so if I glance off screen, I'm looking at a little clock here that tells me how much time I have. So the myth that ESG is difficult to do, what makes this easier to do is clarity by the owner of what they're trying to achieve. So if you can present to your fiduciaries a clarity about what it is that you're looking, what the end result is, it makes their work easier. And the clarity has to be incorporated in your investment policy statement. The screens that you employ should be clear and actionable. Let me go back to clarity though, because a lot of times, we'll sit down and do this inventory with potential clients and or potential investors, and they'll say, well, we want to do good. Well, that's great. It doesn't help us as a fiduciary understand what doing good means. And so we're really trying to get the asset owner to more clearly identify what that good means for them. And the level of specificity is really important. When you say we want to do good, you're leaving it to the fiduciary to make those determinations for you, which I think is, and 9 out of 10 times, because it's so unclear, that's when they can fall back on their responsibilities as a fiduciary. And since it's not clear, we can't do this. So let me give you just an example of what I would do in that situation. And that is, so we want to do good. That's great. Tell me what good means for you. Well, we want to invest in companies that are being positive, having a positive impact to the world versus those that are good. We want to invest in good companies versus bad companies. I'll give you the exact sequence that I usually have. All right, great. What's good for you? Well, our community, congregation, church, organization believes in this. So what I'm trying to do is get the organization to talk about their beliefs first. And from that beliefs, I then can ask a number of questions about, okay, how about from the environment? Do you not want to invest in any companies that are polluting under any circumstances? We usually start off with yes. Okay, that's going to take out 3/4 of the universe that is available for investing. Oh, how about we focus on what are the things that in the environment that are really important to you? Well, we want to have, we're concerned about the companies that pollute the environment a great deal. What I'm trying to do in all of this is trying to get them to get much more focused in the conversation, because if I can get an investment policy statement that says, we don't want to invest in the worst polluters in this sector, I can implement that. If we have a policy that says we want to invest in companies that are doing good for the environment and not those that are doing bad, I can't I can't put that into a strategy. It's not as clear in my mind as a fiduciary acting on your behalf how to do that. It might be clear in your mind, but it's not clear in mine. And the important part is you have to have it clear in my mind as I'm acting as a fiduciary. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the important part of the easier you want this to be, the more clarity you will have to have in the instructions that you give to those who are acting on your behalf as fiduciaries. I've got 6 other things to say, but I'll stop there and wait for questions and answers. I think there might be one more in the myth 3. No, okay. So what this looks at, this is different governance models. You should see yourself in this in some respects. You can change the tabs or the titles, the labels, and at some point, I'm sorry, that was my timer going off. It sounded like a duck, and I like ducks for some reason. They tend to be my. So this really looks at where where different governance models are in place. And it just tries to, it's not meant to capture every exact one, but it's just to try to say from a trend standpoint or from a general standpoint, this is where fiduciary responsibilities lie. So let me just take, looking at the investment manager or managers category. Typically in those cases, they are acting as fiduciaries as it relates to the products that they're managing. So if you're invested in X fund, then they will be a fiduciary for that particular fund. Investment consultant, typically, they act as co-fiduciaries on these typically, because they don't have discretion to direct, which is why if you're dealing with an investment consultant and they are saying, we recommend that you're going to adjust your asset allocation, they're acting as a co-fiduciary. They're recommending because you're the one that has to make the final decision, and you can decide yes or no. There are some, in the last category, we're seeing a rise in the OCIO model, and even in the OCIO model, which is the Outsourced Chief Investment Office. OCIO stands for Outsourced Chief Investment Office. And essentially what a lot of organizations are doing is because they don't have the resources to hire a chief investment officer, they use an OCIO model. And the OCIO model structure, even in that, it varies. Some are co-fiduciaries. In some OCIO models, they're full fiduciaries, which means they have discretion to make those types of decisions. So just so you, again, this is a tool that you can use to kind of say, okay, where does fiduciary responsibility lies? Who has responsibility for the IPS is the investment statement, which is the document that an organization creates to guide the fiduciary's responsibilities. Who has responsibility for asset allocation and rebalancing decisions? Again, depending on what structure you're talking about and what governance model you're talking about, it resides in different places. I suspect this might generate a lot of questions, so I'll just leave it out there. I'm not going to go through piece by piece. I'll just leave it out there and come back to it as questions develop. All right, so the final steps, we're in the home stretch here. The role of the faith-based fiduciary, and we're going to go through this pretty quickly. The faith-based fiduciary understands that as a faith fiduciary, they're called, the institution is called, and they are called to be moral agents in economic life. That the notion that they can say, no, I can't think about these things because I am your numbers guy or numbers girl, or I am the one that, I have the investment field experience and that's what I bring to this table. I don't want to get involved in none of that. That's not what a faith fiduciary really is. Since they're acting on your behalf, one of their responsibilities is not only understanding your economic interests, but also understanding through clear direction from you, your role as a moral agent in economic life and how you want that implemented in the decisions that they make on your behalf. And this is a critical one that I think is lost in lots, as we run around and get people to be on our boards and our committees and exercise the fiduciary responsibility. We get them there and we realize that they don't have the same framework to operate that we have because they haven't been trained in that. They've been trained in a different economic framework. And so it's not surprising that they will say, we can't do this or this. No, you can't. Fiduciaries can't take into consideration your concern about the environment as we invest. Well, yes, not only can they, but they have to. Again, if you've explicitly stated to them in the instructions you've given them through the investment policy statement or other ways. So, and the faith-based investor is actively looking for ways of allowing the mission to flourish while protecting the assets that they're responsible for. And it seeks and is actively seeking to align investment policy with other dimensions of mission. Is not a block to that. So if the faith-based fiduciary is really acting in the best interest, he or she should not be a block to those interests. He or she should be looking for ways to align the investment policy. And there may be times when they come and they say, we're finding it difficult to do so. And that's okay, as long as they consider it and think about it and struggle with that, as opposed to just saying, no, that's not what a fiduciary does. So we're suggesting a new paradigm. I'm sorry, I'm going to cough one more time. Hold on. So we're suggesting here a new paradigm of how we have to think about faith-based fiduciaries. Let's move to the next one. Oh, I missed the one here. So take out Catholic and put in faith fiduciary, and look at the difference one to the other. So a fiduciary in the traditional sense avoids conflicts, maximizes adjusted returns, keeps missions separate from the investment policy. We're saying that a faith fiduciary has a different set of responsibilities. The responsibility is to integrate mission and investment policy, to be an active owner, to see investing as ownership and stewardship, not just ownership, but it's ownership and stewardship, and integrating the faith beliefs with the fiduciary responsibility. And it's part of it is also understanding church teaching as it relates to the investment management process. Every denomination that's represented on this call has teaching that speaks to issues that are directly related to issues that the organization throughout its activities needs to take into consideration. That needs to be part of what a faith fiduciary struggles with and thinks about. Next one. Here we are, the magic Q&A. Let me just wrap up. So I think what all of this is about is just talking about, as someone who sat in front of a number of investment committees over the years, hearing this whole context of fiduciaries fighting back with the organizations that they represent, because their context and framework that they're coming from is different than the context that they're entering as a faith fiduciary. And so part of the role of everyone on the call or others within your organizations is to help that fiduciary understand the different contexts in ways that they probably haven't encountered before. And so you have in front of you a set of tools that might be helpful in that regard. Some very specific because they will come with their tools, and some very mission-oriented in terms of giving them the mission background that they need to have in order to operate from a different context. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. This was really great. Just to let everybody know, I was taking down notes, even though I also know that everybody will be given copies of this, a link to copies of the slides after this. But if you want to unmute yourselves to ask a question, feel free to do so. You can do that basically by touching either the lower left of your screen, depending on the layout, or the upper right of the window with your name or face.
Frank, this is Frank Sherman. I think I'll start the question. You can hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of criticism in the traditional investment space, saying that because of the lack of consistent metrics in measuring ESG performance, that it's not a prudent to even consider ESG factors, because unlike general accounting principles for financials, ESG lacks this consistency. And in fact, you'll have rating agency or institutions that try to rate on various metrics of their own design, and sometimes even coming up with conflicting results. What do you say to an investment advisor or a asset manager who comes back with that kind of argument?
It is. There are different ways of measuring it, but we've been involved in the, and when I say we, I mean all of us around the table, listening to, I wish I could take a poll here. I would ask the question, how many of us have heard managers come in and talk about how a particular measure that they were being measured, S&P 500, small cap index, is not a true measure of what they've really done. And they spend half of the presentation talking about how their performance or how they go about investing is slightly different than those, and therefore we shouldn't use the measure that's in front of them, which is the standard measure. We should use. So we have these conversations even on the investing side where you get that. Now, having said that, I do think that I wouldn't call it inconsistency. There's a variety that doesn't exist on the investing side because there are standard indexes that you can measure yourself. Well, there are also on the ESG side, depending on the issues you're involved in. There is work, and there's a great deal of work, working with the SASB to try to do that sort of activity, working with different of those financial overseers to get more definitive metrics around what good performance should look like. But having said that, given the organization's particular issues around ESG, assuming that they're focused and not broad-based, it is possible to get a particular measure that looks like what you're trying to do, even in the current environment. There are now ESG indexes and measurements that can be looked at in relation to the assets that you're asking a manager to look at or to manage to. So it is a problem. It's not a problem that can. It is a problem. There's significant work being done to address it. And the third point is that there are still ways to do it and find appropriate metrics, depending on what your particular focus is in terms of issue.
I really appreciate especially your comments about clarity on the investment policy statement and how important that is. In the past year, a number of our members actually have been revisiting that and have asked us for some guidance around that. We've shared with them some examples we've seen elsewhere, as well as US SIF tools. And I particularly appreciate as well the use of the word stewardship that you have, Frank, in that, that brings kind of another faith dimension to those sorts of questions. Maybe some of our members have some questions that they're thinking about as they have in front of them in their mind's eye, their investment policy statements, some questions you might have related to how to strengthen those. Or maybe there's another question area entirely that somebody would like to bring forward.
This is Dan Trado from the School Sisters of St. Francis in Milwaukee. I guess it's more of a observation, and as we work with our investment policy statements, it's really not a static document. It's something that we have to look at and adapt as the years go by because the community's priorities change. And so with that, we have to make sure that we're communicating with our investment managers that we created this policy in 2002, we updated it in 2010, it's another 10 years already. And so we need to keep that document fresh and share it. And if we don't let our investment managers know that, we still believe in a lot of what we've historically put onto that document, there's new emphasis. And we want to, make sure that our position is being heard. And as fiduciaries of our assets, we want to make sure that that's being shared with our investment managers and carried on through the companies that we're investing in.
Well, Dan, I think that's a great point. And I would say, that the investment policy statement, you should be looking at it annually, but not annually from the starting all over again, but annually, because your investment policy statement will have your spending policy in it. That is what you're expecting the portfolio to generate that you're using on operations, that you're pulling out of the portfolio. Sometimes it's 4 or 5, 6%, sometimes higher. So those are the things, they're components of the investment policy statement that you need to revisit. I would say annually, maybe let's say even every other year, to make sure that they still reflect where you're at. And so if you have an investment policy statement that has a spending policy that is talking about 2%, and you're in a position where you've been taking 10% out every year, you need to make that change, because your marching orders to your fiduciaries it's bled into changing without changing the document that they're responsible for. And most fiduciaries, if they notice that, they'll come back and say, there's a disconnect here. And I would suggest every couple of years to look back and say, are the issues around which we've, our risk tolerance level, are there issues that we define in our social guidelines, are those still intact? And I would even say, since you're coming from a Catholic institution, when leadership changes, there needs to be, shortly after new leadership comes in, there needs to be some measure of review. And leadership could be the investment policy statement, I assume is the investment committee. There needs to be some policy review so that they are in, your new members come in, they're coming in with their own predilections, then your policy doesn't meet where they would need to be. So that's what I would recommend, is when you have a change, at some point after the change, when they've kind of settled in, you take a look at that again. But it was a great point. I think you're right.
Frank, just to follow up, sorry to dominate the questioning, but what about the best practices around training asset managers and brokers? I fear, as Dan said, his policy last updated 2010. I fear that as the asset managers and brokers change out, these investment policies tend to just be put on the shelf. How do you train and assess, or some best practices on how you ensure alignment with the people managing your money?
Well, I think, again, that goes to how often you take a look at it. My recommendation is a year. And in fact, I have to say, if your asset manager or consultant or whomever you're using that's acting on that behalf, providing you advice, is not bringing this to you, there's a problem there. Then if they're not saying, we need to look at this annually or semi-annually, or typically not semi-annual, every 2 years or so, that would be of concern, because they are as concerned about the document as you are. It's their marching orders. And so they'll want to make sure, and I especially suspect that if things start to drift from what's in the document, they'll be in touch with you. But I think that you should be, as part of your annual review with them, you should be making sure that they understand this policy is still in effect. Do they understand it? Or they have questions about it, et cetera, et cetera. So as part of your annual review, there should be some time allotted to review of the investment policy statement and making sure it's still in place. And when I talk about change, that's also true with your managers. If you have, the portfolio manager in your account is changing, you need to make sure that, again, you have that conversation once the new one comes in and all that sort of stuff.
We've gone about 10 minutes past the hour. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to squeeze in one more question, or actually maybe it's an appropriate time just again, Frank, to thank you for being with us and to salute you for a long and venerable career in this area. And even though your time with CBIS is drawing to a close, we do look forward to your ongoing contributions in helping us align our portfolios with our mission. You've done a lot to advance it over the breadth of your career, and even today, I think you've given us some tools to continue to march forward in this effort. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time and attention you're able to give, and good luck.
Thanks. And we will send out then the slides and the video as well as an evaluation to everybody. In this evaluation, there's also a final question, which will be looking at other things that our members would like to learn about or explore in other webinars. And so we really do appreciate your feedback in that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.